Hello, welcome back to my channel if you're a subscriber, and welcome if you're new here. Today I'm going to seek to answer the question, are mass shooters mentally ill? I'm doing this in lieu of reading the fourth chapter from my book, Strange Fire in a Vacuum. My name is Penelope Gristelfink. That is a pen name. I created it because I was once a journalist, but I also write fiction. So professional reasons dictated that I adopt this name, and now I'm stuck with it. I have published this book and it is available on Amazon. It was written mostly in 2017 to about 2019, and then finally self-published in 2020. These are some of the key points that I make in my book about mass shooters. I wrote this book because I felt that media coverage didn't offer much in the way of an explanation for this phenomenon, and also that there was a sort of profile that was coming together in my head that I didn't hear communicated very often in coverage of these events. So I sat down and I thought, what is really operating in terms of motivation for these killings? And I came to the conclusion that one, they're not really a variant of homicide so much as of suicide. That in most cases, the actors had a desire to be killed at the scene or kill themselves. Because the majority of them were men, I started looking at toxic masculinity as it is proliferating in mass culture. Came to the conclusion that most of these individuals were not psychotic or conventionally mentally ill, but rather that many of them appeared to have the attributes of narcissistic personality disorder. I contend that that does not make them mentally ill, although in a technical sense, there are many licensed clinical psychologists who would disagree with me on that point. I just have some very strong ethical and analytical objections to conflating personality disorders with other types of mental disorders that we can treat with or think we can treat with medications and therapy. I came to the conclusion too that there was something deeper than depression or anxiety at work, that most of these people suffer from a form of existential despair that's not really often talked about in psychological literature. I also speculated that this was driven in part by a reaction to postmodernism and different forms of technology as they are shaping our lives and culture. In particular, how individuals feel overwhelmed when dealing with an onslaught of change related to technology in their lives and in the workforce. So then I looked at who else had these ideas about postmodernism and technology, and I arrived at the work of the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who was not a mass shooter, but was a mass killer, and wrote extensively from his own point of view about what he saw as being problematic in modern life. He wrote, from the perspective of someone who believed that technology was more harmful than helpful, and diagnosed a number of other social dysfunctions as being related to the dominance of technology over modern people. And finally, this is a point that I'm most proud of. I came to the conclusion that the rise in mass shootings was predictive of more organized political violence. And I think that since 2020, a number of events have borne that out. And now what we're seeing and what we're living through is an overlap in politically violent acts and more conventional mass shooting phenomenon. In fact, I asked ChatGPT to analyze this, what I perceive to be a spike in the incidence of mass shootings following the shooting of Charlie Kirk. And it did not seem to think there was a particularly statistically significant spike. But that's what I'm going to be focusing on in the future, is trying to track whether or not certain political events actually touch off a spate of mass shootings, because there is sort of a snowball effect of mass shootings themselves inspiring more mass shootings. So, the fourth chapter of my book is titled Mass Shooters Are Not Mentally Ill. Depriving mentally ill people of gun rights and subjecting them to greater scrutiny will neither solve the problem nor represent an advancement in social justice. I do not believe that mass shooters are mentally ill, although it is becoming more and more common for people in positions of power, police chiefs, governors, legislators, president, to blanketly deploy this statement that anybody who commits such a crime has to, by definition, be mentally ill. And frankly, as a psychiatric survivor, as someone who spent about 2 decades recovering from being labeled myself with psychiatric disorder after disorder, I am disturbed and distressed at the use of this term mental illness as a catch-all for so many different social problems. And I find it disturbing because I have this sense that the more that we blame mental illness for specific societal ills, the less we're actually going to be investing in deeper, more fruitful analysis of these problems and potential solutions outside of the psychiatric industry, outside of what I call the mental health care industrial complex. So this is a list of things that off the top of my head, I can tell you that people know are problems in our society and routinely blame mental illness for causing, without having any specificity in their language or data to back it up. Mental illness is blamed for poverty. It's blamed for poor performance in school and work. It's blamed for financial difficulties and homelessness. It's blamed for addiction, and now it's being blamed for crime. So, just as a personal anecdote, about 10 years ago, I went through a period of rather intense poverty where I myself was living in a ghetto in a boarding house room, working as a waitress and working as a front desk agent for hotels. I had lived in the Virgin Islands for 2 years. I had been a journalist, and I had found that I could not keep up with the standards of mostly massive unpaid overtime and inflicted burnout that being a newspaper reporter in a very competitive market with very little resources, et cetera, et cetera. We were just massively understaffed, and everybody was working 60 to 80 hours a week. So I moved back and I went back into the service industry, and I was single, and I used to volunteer at a homeless shelter a few blocks from where I lived, and I would make breakfast in the mornings for a few months because volunteering was part of how I was attempting to cope with a very situational depression. And I thought giving back and being in contact with others would help me. Well, it did for a little while, but I became really frustrated because the majority of recipients of this kind of aid were working. They were like me. They were working full time. They were working one or two jobs at the same time. They were working for places like Motel 6 and Popeyes, and they still couldn't afford to make rent on an apartment in the area. And I would talk to some of my more bougie former friends, and they would rattle off this phrase. Well, most of the people who end up as homeless, they have untreated mental illness. And I just felt like throwing cold water on them because I felt like saying, maybe that was true 10 or 20 years ago, but based on what I'm seeing, these people are working. They're just simply poor. They cannot make enough money through their jobs to keep a roof over their head, and yet they continue to work. So there's probably plenty of data and stats on that, but it just really rubbed me the wrong way. Likewise, it really rubs me the wrong way when I see all of these other issues blamed on mental illness without more examination of, well, if that's the case, why are so many people becoming so mentally ill? Could it be that we are creating conditions that we refuse to address? So let's talk about that. What is mental illness and what is mental health? First and foremost, it is a belief system, it is a paradigm. And like any belief system, it will become overarching. It can become overarching. It helps us interpret our everyday reality. We take it for granted that some people are normal and some people are not normal. And we take it for granted that if persons have a problem with eating, a problem with moods, a problem with modulating their emotions, a problem with expressing themselves, a problem with growing their relationships, um, a problem with time management, a problem with mass media consumption. So all of these things can be pulled into this sort of umbrella. And all of these systems of belief posit that fundamentally the most important unit, the locus of agency, is in the individual. One of my favorite authors who actually attempts to get at why all of this belief system is problematic is James Davies. He has written two books. One of them is called Sedated: How Modern Capitalism Created Our Mental Health Crisis. The other one is called Cracked: Why Psychiatry is Causing More Harm Than Good. I think that's the title. I might be getting that wrong. But his fundamental assertion is that we are using psychiatry as an escape hatch while society crumbles. And the more society crumbles, the more it creates undue stressors in individuals. Those undue stressors become reinterpreted through an industry that is well situated in the broader economic context as symptoms. So people's problems are not really problems. If you don't make enough money at work, then it's really because you haven't self-actualized, or because you have depression that holds you back from doing the kinds of improvements to yourself that would elevate you within the workforce. if you have any number of problems, they can be reinterpreted as a deficiency that therapy and meds can correct. So I'll read this quote. As the renowned clinical psychologist Dr. Ann Cook put it to me in conversation, the mental illness narrative encourages us to see mental health problems as nothing to do with life and circumstances. So no wonder we don't look at structural or social causes. And of course, this perspective is a great fit with the current neoliberal approach, where individuals have to reform themselves to fit within existing social structures. The trouble with programs that are blind to the perils of such adaptations is that they essentially neuter political reflection on why distress proliferates in our schools, certainly when compared to schools in most other developed nations. Here's another quote. And this explains the link between the popularity, the explosion of mental health care, and a fundamental shift from the 60s and 70s into the 80s in how we view the proper role of the state in the economic outcomes for a population. So it used to be the case that we were much more, I don't know whether I would say socialistic in our outlook, but certainly there were trends in that direction. And then a number of thinkers rose up in the 80s and they created this sort of right-wing revolution. For instance, Margaret Thatcher was quoted as saying, there is no such thing as society. So, in other words, people need to get off their asses and quit crying for the state to save them. Pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, etc., etc. So, this is him quoting a man named Tim Kasser. The heyday of humanistic psychology was in the 1960s and 1970s when Keynes dominated. But since the rise of neoliberalism from the 1980s, we've seen an influx of cognitive behavioral approaches and psychiatric drugs, technologies that put the cause of the problem right between your ears. The therapies our governments now want all focus on internal, not external reform. They don't see suffering as a call to change external circumstances for the good of our development. I believe that mental health is a myth. I have recently become more and more discomforted by the fact that in my social life, I seem to not have a single friend who themselves is not taking some kind of psychotropic or going to some sort of therapy for a disorder they believe they have and or has a spouse or a child who is doing likewise. It seems like every time I just want to discuss where I really am in my journey as a psychiatric survivor and how it has led me to completely want to distrust all labels and the whole diagnostic paradigm, I encounter this sort of stifling resistance in not wanting to step on people's toes or hurt their feelings because everybody believes that something is wrong with them, that they can grasp onto these labels and deploy them as a descriptor and potentially a source of solace and social currency. And the worst part for me is when people medicalize their children, because I was medicalized as a teenager and it really did not help me at all. So, this is what I believe. Mental health is a myth. It supports industry. It's part of optimization culture, which if you've been anywhere on the internet, you've been exposed to unremittingly. Optimization culture, the self-improvement, productivity, blah, 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 supports the economic myths of meritocracy and of personal identity and responsibility. It lends itself well to the expansion of the surveillance state. It invites all of us to interpret our behavior, attitudes, and experiences and feelings through a lens. And the lens is the elusive normative baseline. People literally believe that psychology is a science. But if you read authors such as James Davies, they actually go into great detail about the history of the DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that psychiatrists and psychologists use. And the writing of this book is mind-blowingly unscientific. There's not data. There aren't surveys, there aren't tests, there aren't brain scans, there aren't biomarkers. There's absolutely nothing medical about it. It's all done by consensus and it's all done by committee. And that committee is in itself a sort of educational elite. It's a bunch of people who've risen to the top of their fields as psychologists or psychiatrists who get together in a room and, based on their own personal experience and biases and wants and needs, determine what will be considered illness. Literally. Then they make it up and write it down. Then it becomes an instrument that the industry uses. So there you go. That's what I'm talking about when I say elusive normative baseline. It's also expanded itself about 5 times the length that it used to be, which means that more and more and more diagnoses exist that didn't in the past. Furthermore, some of the ones in the past have been thrown out because they've been depoliticized. So, for example, we used to think that homosexuals were so because of it was a mental disorder. Okay, we no longer do. Um, and I could go on. I'm not going to go on, but it's ridiculous the history of this thing. So this baseline is determined by an elite group of unelected, highly educated people who do not use data, but rather subjective criteria, to continuously expand the pool of non-normative behavior in a societal context that already demands higher degree of intellectual sophistication and conformity in the average citizen than at any other time in our history as a species. I believe that in order to feel like you have a well-grounded, fruitful, successful existence, you are required to acquire more and more skill sets and to deal with a glut of information and stimulation to the brain than in any other time in our species. I believe that in order to work and live and be an adult, the it's just a systemic overload of the nervous system, which is not at all capable of evolving at the same rate that the technology which is inflicting these stressors on us is. So I tried to come up with an analogy of a similar concept or a belief system. Um, And I couldn't come up with one that was quite as totalitarian as what I believe this mental health paradigm is. But I kind of hit upon the concept of the American frontier and how this was just a concept. It never existed. So all of the lands to the west of the Mississippi were inhabited, and they were not blank space. They were not out there virgin land inhabited by savages. They were actually that was actually land which for hundreds of thousands of years had been the space in which civilizations flourished or failed, but we came up with this concept of the frontier because it was ideologically useful. And in American culture, it supported territorial expansion. It supported modes of agricultural production and white cultural supremacy. So it was incredibly powerful, but it also never existed in reality, in truth. There was no such thing ever as the frontier. So let's talk about mass shootings. Since 1987, there's been this precipitous rise in the frequency of mass shootings, and they seem to have also become more deadly. So I wrote the book because, I was not doing very well in our culture, in our society, and I was a doomer, and I really felt like I'd been put through the ringer. Everything that I tried to do failed. I went to college, got real jobs, got laid off from those real jobs because of technology and industry changeover. Felt like I was incapable of competing. I also lived through the recession, had all the typical struggles, was evicted, laid off, like I said, saw a real decline in my material quality of life, and felt also that America was on the cusp of political decline and chaos. That just things were where I was seeing more and more corruption prevailing, um, more and more inequality. Nothing really made sense anymore. So I was like, once mass shootings came on the scene, I thought, like, well, that's pretty much evidence of what I'm talking about. Like, we're going into the shitter, and if nothing else says in big red flashing lights, decline, 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 the fact that quote unquote ordinary Americans are killing at this rate in this way. I mean, if that, I don't know what else to point to as evidence of utter just decline, failure. So, so depending, sources vary depending on how you define a mass shooter. So the FBI active shooter reports are just very strict in their narrowly defining a mass shooting as somebody who's actively seeking um, public attention through the act, and there are about 30 to 60 a year since the early 2000s. But if you look at gun violence overall, there's 400 to 700 gun violence incidents a year. So we're already operating in the context of an extraordinarily violent culture, and that's something to bear in mind. We are an extraordinarily violent species, and we always have been. We actually became the apex predator on this planet by committing a genocide of Neanderthals. So at one point we coexisted with another Homo species, and that was intolerable to us. So we killed absolutely all of them and made them extinct. Mass shootings are getting more frequent. This is a graph that shows the rise in frequency since 1965, 1969. They're also claiming more victims. So a mass shooting is generally defined by law enforcement as 4 or more victims. We have seen them become more deadly, particularly since 2014. We have a lot more data than when I wrote the book, but my points still stand. I highly recommend it. If you want to get more into it, please read it. It's important that you read it because I have seen much more I've seen a lot more videos actually expressing my profile by many more skilled YouTubers with a lot more qualifications than I have. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I didn't even get a psychology degree. I majored in English. And then I was a crime reporter for 1 year. And then I went on to be a hard news reporter in the Virgin Islands for a year, in which I covered a lot of drug trafficking and public corruption type cases, but that wasn't my exclusive beat. So I was heartened to see that more and more people were pushing aspects of my thesis, and that more and more of the media was pulling from experts that I quote in my book. But I want to encourage you to read the book because it goes a little bit further than what I'm hearing still, and talks about frameworks of looking at this question of existential enemy, existential despair. I use Viktor Frankl as a source a lot, and I talk about other cultural issues that we have, such as the effect of social media, inequality, the decay of democratic systems. Um, and people again and again seem mystified. How can people commit these acts? And what I'm attempting to do is to pull you into the void, the vacuum, the howling, screaming despair that results from narcissism, from fundamentally becoming so disconnected from others that any kind of personal grievance becomes, it blots out this morality that is installed through social conditioning. So something is clearly going wrong. But if we continue to not go deeper and deeper and really look at what's going on in the minds of these people and just say they are mentally ill, we'll deflect from what's actually going on. Okay, so what actually are the stats on mass shooters? How many of them are mentally ill? According to the Violence Project and other databases, 25%. When I wrote the book, I only had stats from the Secret Service that said anywhere between 20 to 59% of them. Now they've narrowed it down. 25% seems statistically significant, right? 1 in 4. So you would think, what is wrong with the statement that mass shooters, that mental illness is a contributing factor to mass shootings? Well, what's wrong with it is that it doesn't differ that much. It doesn't offset this group of people from the general population. So 25% of mass shooters have a prior mental health diagnosis. But what is the stat for the general population? Well, that's about neck and neck. It's 23.1% of the general population carries the diagnosis. That's 45 million Americans. People wanted to do this with race too when I was writing the book, and that's one of the things that I debunked. They wanted to say over and over again, I read article after article that claimed that it was aggrieved white men, that whiteness was making men more violent. And so at the time I looked at the stats, it was something like 60 to 67% were white. But then I had to take a step back and say, well, what percentage of the general population is white? And again, it just mirrored. So there was nothing about that stat, about that demographic, that suggested that the people showing up and doing this were demographically different than the general population, which is what is so frightening when you really think about it. Now, the thing about mental illness rates is that they have risen precipitously since 1975. So in 1975, 15% of the general population in America carried a mental health diagnosis, and there are reasons for this. That said, we all have to take great care to point out that the percentage of violent crime committed by mentally ill people remains, across most sources, less than 5%. Furthermore, crime statistics back up that mentally ill people are 3 to 5 times more likely to be the victims of crime than people who are neurotypical or the general population. Okay, bear that in mind. So, because it's being proposed over and over again that we rely on the mental health care system to curtail mass shootings, let's talk about the size and the scope of this system. It really irritates me when people quoted in the news claim that we have a broken mental health system, because it seems to me that you can't escape the system, that it's larger and more invasive than it has ever been. Currently, there are 25 to 30,000 psychiatrists at work in the United States. I wanted to do a comparison of mental health care providers to back pain specialists, because back pain is another extraordinarily common ailment. I found that there were 27 to 28,000 orthopedic surgeons specializing in back pain. But beyond that, within the mental health care system, there are about 106,000 licensed psychologists, 200,000 therapists, because you don't have to be a licensed psychologist to provide therapy. And there are anywhere between 0.28 and 1.02 million social workers. Since 2020, about 30% of American adults have seen a therapist. In 2021, about 42 million people received treatment or counseling for their mental health. 17% of American teens see a therapist each year. And every year, about 20% of working adults experience a mental health issue, such as depression or anxiety. Around 25% of adult women have received some form of mental health treatment in the past year, compared to about 15% of men. These stats vary if depending on race. Black adults, Latino and Hispanic adults are less likely to be receiving therapy, and nearly 50% of married couples in the US have gone to counseling at one point in their relationship. Okay, so my question is, what's broken about this system? It seems to me to be extraordinarily functional and powerful. It seems to me to be being utilized quite thoroughly by the American population. So what is broken about it? Furthermore, if you're going to posit that this is the system that is going to save us from mass shootings, I would ask you why it has not already, given the prevalence of it. This is the total cost of our broken mental health care system, according to ChatGPT. I asked it to give me stats and cite sources. I asked it to include prison services, school counselors, referrals by social workers, hospitalizations, medications, therapy, and the like. And it gave me a breakdown, and the big final number it spit out was that we are spending between 200 and 300 billion dollars annually on this system, which is about 1% of our GDP. Thus, we are going to arrive at what is called by certain authors I have read the treatment prevalence paradox. What that means is that it's a counterintuitive truth that the more we have expanded, funded, and popularized mental health treatment in our society, the sicker the population has become. This is not what we have seen with other illnesses. We have seen fewer and fewer deaths from breast cancer or other forms of cancer the more time, research, money, and access we give the general population. But with mental illness, it works the opposite. So this is simply the observation that the rates climb the more treatment we push onto people. So so one of my favorite authors in this vein is Robert Whitaker. He wrote a groundbreaking work of investigative journalism called Anatomy of an Epidemic, in which he blew the whistle on the psychiatric industry for causing more pain, distress, and disability through medicating people. This was something that I quietly kept to myself because, as I've discussed before, being a psychiatric survivor and knowing these truths and having lived these truths and walked away from the industry, I'm at risk of making my social life basically a running argument with anybody and everybody. And because my social life is something that I value very much, and I think it's become rather threadbare, I'm at pains. But Robert Whitaker pointed out that since 1987, the number of Americans disabled by mental illness has nearly doubled. And that dovetails with the use of psychiatric prescriptions. Psychiatric prescriptions exploded in the 1990s. And yet more and more and more and more of these drug takers were onboarded into the SSDI system for mental disorders. They couldn't work, they couldn't go to school, they couldn't hold a job, and they were considered fully disabled because they were taking the treatment that was prescribed to them. So he started to look, well, why? Why? So outpatient treatment rates for depression have quadrupled since 1987. While at the same time, more and more Americans are taking an antidepressant. Antidepressants are some of the most commonly prescribed drugs currently. This is a quote from Whitaker's book. We have been focusing on the role that psychiatry and its medications may be playing in this epidemic, and the evidence is quite clear. First, by greatly expanding diagnostic boundaries, psychiatry is inviting an ever greater number of children and adults into the mental illness camp. Second, those so diagnosed and then treated with psychiatric medications that increase the likelihood they will become chronically ill. Many treated with psychotropics end up with new and more severe psychiatric symptoms, physically unwell and cognitively impaired. This is the tragic story writ large in 5 decades of scientific literature. I used to go, when I was first diagnosed with bipolar disorder in my 20s, I used to go to mental health support groups. And I quit going because the other adults that I met there who were older than me terrified me. The ones with bipolar disorder who had reached the age of 50 or so no longer worked, could barely speak. They were very overweight. They had tremors. They could not hold a conversation without great difficulty. And I was like, what's up with that? Because they've been on treatment for longer than I have, so they should be better. They should be better with their bipolar disorder, right? And they frightened me. I have come to the conclusion that we are barking up the wrong tree. So, in order for us to really examine why people are killing each other the way they are in the streets, we need to just sort of back off of the resorts to individual psychology because it's too easy. Okay. You're not going to just foist medication on people when they're reacting to life stressors that are being created actively by systems that have nothing to do with the mental health system. The mental health system is a shock absorber. So if we haven't learned this lesson through COVID, I don't know what it will take. But when there's mass economic volatility, when there are disruptions, natural disasters, or when people cannot, for instance, buy a house well into their 40s and 50s after working their asses off, or when they are elderly and unable to retire, we're setting up all these sorts of situational log jams and then forcing people through them and calling all this friction mental illness. That's my opinion. And I'm really tired of it. I did want to major in psychology, but the only branch of psychology that really truly has any validity for me anymore is social psychology and sociology. But sociology is looking at the friction points and groups of people, and it's not always going to resort to the individual lens. Okay. So, um, I just think we should probably take a look at why the discourse of abnormal psychology is so dominant and popular. The side by side comparison of how we place our where we place the credence, where we place the importance. It's obvious. We've supported the development of clinical psychology, and we've let social psychology and sociology languish as fields. So I asked ChatGPT to compare these two fields using the number of practicing professionals, the number of degree holders, the amount of research funding at major universities, media appearances and publications. And in all four criteria, clinical and abnormal psychology was the clear winner. Let's talk about mass shooter stats. And let's see where the mental illness, having or not having, falls in terms of predictive importance. So 97% of mass shooters are men. 70 to 80% of them have suicidal ideation going on. 80% of them have suffered a personal crisis recently, or they have somehow developed what is called a grievance mentality. So there is some sort of grievance. They have perceived wrongs. They may have been fired. They may have been dumped by a significant other. They may have been passed over for a promotion. They may feel that they lost a court case. Whatever, it becomes an all-consuming, rather than just a point of adversity in that one part of their story. They seem unable to get past it, and they see everything and anything as a potential activator of this urge to ruminate on the whatever the wrong was. Violence is often a sort of protest against perceived humiliation or disrespect. That is true of other homicidal actors, not just mass shooters. 54% of them have a domestic violence history, allegation, some kind of charge. 28% of them have a military background. Okay, so stop and think for a moment. How often have you heard it discussed in the press? How often have you heard somebody in law enforcement or somebody, a politician, taking the podium after one of these tragedies, explain that we all need to be vigilant against veterans? And yet, that's more predictive by 3 percentage points than a mental illness diagnosis. And 23% of them have substance abuse problem. So these are my big takeaways. I think mental illness is a garbage term. I think that we use it now to describe anything and everything. Myself, I had very severe symptoms when having episodes of poor brain health. So I've actually suffered psychosis. I know what it's like to hear voices. I know what it's like to not sleep for days on end. I know what it's like to, quote, act out of character. Um, I was even arrested in the throes of a mental breakdown. Um, but now, so that was 25 years ago. Now what I see is that these much more surface level benign behaviors are somehow being triggering of diagnoses. And I also see much more monitoring of people in their everyday environments. For example, I dated a man whose child was 8 or 9 years old. And at school, these paraprofessionals were monitoring and scrutinizing the children's behavior so strictly, so abundantly, that he would get these real-time line item reports of every time the child fidgeted, made an expression out of turn, splashed water over the sink when washing hands, was boisterous, or was in any way, shape, or form not docile, not compliant, and not quiet. So looking at that, thinking, oh my God, what are we creating here? Like, this is a school. I've taught children. Nothing that this child was doing that was making it into these highly clinical language reports seemed to me in any way aberrant or age inappropriate. Yet, here was all of this documentation and data that could be deployed should the child need to be diagnosed with some kind of something. And 80% of his peers in that classroom had an individualized education plan, meaning they were seeking treatment or accommodation, or their parents were, based on the idea that this child has some kind of deficiency or disorder or learning disability. And I thought to myself, oh, I'm so glad that I'm not a child or a parent today, because I couldn't deal. I don't think mental illness has a lot of predictive value when it comes to mass shootings, but I can understand why everybody has this sort of hyper vigilance around it, because it's so deadly. But my point is, we're also applying this sort of hyper vigilance to people, and it's creating yet another stress layer in their lives. It's demanding conformity, and I'm not really sure that that demand will be met with anything but greater and greater levels of dysfunction, particularly as these children age, and particularly in male children. Okay. If you look at the rise in popularity of Gen Z alt-right influencers, many of them are male, and many of them are reacting to this culture. Another problem with the mental illness garbage umbrella term is that it conflates mood disorders and other disorders with cluster B personality disorders, and no one in the media bothers to take the time to make that distinction because they don't have the education or the training. Now, I have a lot of problems, like I said, with the cluster B, the deployment of cluster B. I think it hides a lot. I think a lot of people diagnosed with cluster B are post-traumatic, and I think that that obscures responsibility and accountability. I think many of them are abuse victims. That was the case with me. I'm not interested anymore in people's opinions of my personality. I'm not interested. I just don't engage with the system. But I see more and more people, even narcissists that I've known some very well, very intimately, and I feel bad calling them that because they really did suffer child abuse, sustained abuse. So I think that more and more mental illness deflects from the inability of people in today's world to put the resources into child rearing, and the way that the social fabric is being torn apart, and we no longer have the environment to nurture stable family units in which people can impart things like self-esteem to their children. It takes time that they no longer have because they're working their asses off to keep up with this capitalist machine. Um, so again, I would encourage people to actually learn the facts, learn the stats, and when you hear people talk about mass shooters being mentally ill, just point out that they are, but the general population has the same rate of mental illness, so it doesn't distinguish them in any way. Go for precision. Okay, reject sloppy language and analysis. So when somebody says they have mental illness, you need to say, what do you mean by mental illness? Do you mean an eating disorder, a mood disorder? Do you mean depression? Do you mean OCD? What do you mean by mental illness? Because that is different than a personality disorder. And people with personality disorders often will not respond in the same fashion to psychotropics, and psychotropics are way less effective at treating even the things that they're quote unquote designed to treat, which many of them aren't even designed to treat. They're just off-label uses thrown down people's throats. So we need to stop stigmatizing sufferers of mental illness by linking them falsely to this phenomenon, because God knows life is hard enough as it is. For whatever reason, whatever they're dealing with, that they are finding needs to be described with a diagnosis. Okay, I don't dispute that suffering is real. I just don't like the typology, the categorization impulse. I'm not the only one. There are a lot of people doing work around this. So we hold people in power accountable. When the president says we need to bring back the mental institutions, what? Because we have a giant mental health industry already. Support the fields that offer the solutions instead of just categorization. Okay? Support the fields that are looking at things like demographics. There's this whole excess male hypothesis that's coming out of sociological research that I'm very interested in. It has nothing to do with depression. Okay? So, mental health and poor mental health services. Oh, these are some quotes. There's a very good video that I will put in link to in the description of this by a practicing therapist, a man with an actual psych degree, and his channel is called Neuro Transmissions, and he did a much better job of concisely debunking this whole mental illness is causing mass shooter phenomenon. And I looked at the comments of that video, and I pulled a couple of them that I thought were very pertinent. Mental health and poor mental health services are absolutely a factor. But what does he mean by that? When I tried to seek help for my homicidal urges, I was abused medically in a psych ward, which only worsened my homicidality and made me not want to seek help. I was able to get better on my own after years of hard work, but who the hell would ever seek help when they know they'll be treated like an animal? So before you throw more people down this garbage chute of a system, you should look into what's actually going on in that system. And you should bear in mind that, again, if it had solutions to offer, we have to ask the question, why are mass shootings happening concurrently with the expansion of the system? It seems to be doing nothing so far to prevent it. So why should we trust that we should resort to more and more of the same system? we're not going to get different results. That's my fear. Having gone through okay, this is another quote from a commenter. Having gone through psychosis once upon a time, I can't imagine a person who planned and carried out a mass shooting being in the proper state, being in the state of psychosis at the same time. I just don't see how that is possible. Okay, I concur. I also have been psychotic. You can't, these acts are not the act of psychotic people because they require the person be lucid enough to have a goal and execute on that goal. This is behavior that shows logic. This is often premeditated. It is not psychosis. So, a good resource for you before you leap to the conclusion that we must expand mental institutions and then preemptively flag people and push them into that in order for them to not become mass shooters is this book called Your Consent is Not Required: The Rise in Psychiatric Detentions, Forced Treatment, and Abusive Guardianships by a man named Rob Whitepond. He's a journalist whose father suffered a terrible injury. He had become impotent because he had prostate cancer and developed situational depression afterwards. And he was forcibly hospitalized and given electroshocks and medications that compounded his suffering. Now, he looked at, in Canada and the US, the rates of psychiatric hospitalization, involuntary hospitalization, involuntary treatment. It is a myth that since we deinstitutionalized people in the 70s and 80s, there was a big push to tear down the mental hospitals. And now there is this outcry that that was a mistake and maybe we wouldn't be dealing with so many homeless, addicted people on the streets, and there's nowhere to put them, and then they end up in prison or they end up in the hospital. But this kind of treatment is still quite pervasive. It's still much more common than you think, and it's very, very inhumane. So if you don't believe me, read the book. This is the basis for the book. This is part of the blurb on Amazon. Psychiatric coercion is increasingly used to manage school children and the elderly, quell family conflicts, police the streets, control people in shelters, community living, and prisons, fraudulently increase hospital profits, resolve workplace disagreements, and detain protesters and discredit whistleblowers. So the potential for abuse is quite vast. Now, part of this has come about from the industry pushing more and more meds on people, and it was all part of a psychoeducation campaign. So I had a very adverse reaction to Prozac when I was 16, and it damaged my brain, and it led to me having manias. Now, you could say that that was a statistically fluky event, but it's not. It's borne out in the testimony of others, countless others, hundreds of thousands of people. Antidepressants, if they don't do that to you, they often will produce withdrawal effects that the industry has also concealed from people, and specifically from doctors who are actually prescribing them. A good channel to watch is Dr. Joseph Witt-During. He's a whistleblower psychiatrist himself, whose entire practice is devoted to undoing some of the damages and harms from people who have been prescribed these medications. But, I constantly see things and hear things. So, for example, it's quite common for people in nursing homes to be inundated with psychotropics. And it's quite common for doctors who don't have any education in psychology to prescribe antidepressants right off the bat to someone who's just been diagnosed with breast cancer. It's also extremely common in the wake of the death of the loved one for a JP to give antidepressants to people who are sad for more than 2 weeks. Okay. So we're not talking about more and more of the population being born with a chemical imbalance in their brain. These are not genetic illnesses. These are simply, this is a permissive use. This is a loose, permissive dosing of people, ordinary people facing ordinary circumstances that are less than ideal with medication. So, back to mass shooters. If they're not mentally ill, what are they? I'm going to read this. It's a from a comment thread on the Neuro Transmissions channel, talking about the importance of personal grievances at work. It's a tunnel vision, right? It's a tunnel vision. Now, if you've suffered from depression, maybe you experience tunnel vision yourself, where it just seems impossible to imagine a brighter, more hopeful future for yourself. Somehow, if you couple the tunnel vision and you externalize it in rage against others and rage against authority, because after all, if you're a man and you've invested decades of your life in this culture and believe in authority, and somehow you feel betrayed, the brittleness. I think we overlook fragility in men, okay? And this is the cost of it. Stephen Paddock shot, I think, 49 people at a concert in Las Vegas. A sign of personal grievance for the Vegas shooter was presented by the Daily Mail in a 2020 article showcasing what looks like screenshots from a chat log between the perp and an escort in days prior to the shooting. The perp discussed wanting emotional support and how he felt a lot of people don't deserve to be alive, as he accuses them of being selfish and take what they need from him and then discard him. This aligns with some speculations that he viewed his then girlfriend as a gold digger, a grievance, right? And in an FBI report was known to complain about how casinos no longer treat high rollers very well. What's ironic about these comments is that he himself had a history of using people and systems to elevate himself. He was rich through legal loopholes, cheated on his girlfriend repeatedly while engaging in violent, possibly pedophilic fantasies with escorts. Whether the result of a personal grievance, something political gain, or delusions, the core factor to all these mass shootings are a lack of empathy for others and an inflated sense of self. Okay, so this is a highly narcissistic individual who seems mind blind to his own behavior and yet externalizes and feels that other people owe him. Another thing that struck me in my research was that there wasn't a lot of data to support the idea that these mass shooters are class revolutionaries. Most of them seem rather bourgeois. And then I started to look like they were not on skid row financially. They may have suffered setbacks, but most of them seem drawn from a middle class cohort of people that's constantly being talked about as being squeezed or diminished in our media commentary. So I wondered why that is. And I wondered if maybe a relative coat of affluence or of prosperity didn't actually encourage a sort of narcissistic, like, the world owes me this, and if I don't get it, other people are going to pay for my inflated sense of self. It must be maintained. And then there's also the fame seeking element, which feeds into that. So a great deal of them leave manifestos, a great deal of them seem to be engaged in actual competition with other mass shooters, and they dwell on beforehand the notoriety that they're going to achieve. So is this best explained through individual pathology or social conditioning? It really depends on how much you wanted to confront the fact that whether or not you want to create, you could create a whole other DSM category just for mass shooters. But it wouldn't explain why our culture is producing them at such a great rate, in my opinion. It's just an observation. Observations are not explanations. Correlation is not causation. And sooner or later, if all of these bad apples are coming out of the barrel, you need to look at the barrel. You need to look at how it's constructed and what is inside it. Psychosis does not live in the head. It lives in the in-between of family members and in the in-between of people, Salo explained. It is in the relationship, and the one who is psychotic makes the bad condition visible. He or she wears the symptoms and has the burden to carry them. So this was from Robert Whitaker's Anatomy of an Epidemic. Part of what encouraged him to do his research is that he came across a study by the World Health Organization comparing the rates of remission of schizophrenia across cultures. And he discovered that World Health Organization researchers found that in cultures with a less well-funded psychiatric industry where there's no reach of doctors, traditional cultures, such as India and Brazil, I think, I don't remember off the top of my head, they would find that people would go through these vast psychiatric episodes that we label schizophrenia and have full-blown delusions, hallucinations, and the like, and not be medicated, but be treated through reintegration and social supports. And they were likely 3 times as likely as American schizophrenics to years on down the line report no symptoms. So, in other words, their schizophrenia erupted, and then over the course of years, it healed, and they were not experiencing a recurrence. They weren't constantly losing their mind, hearing voices, da da da. And so there was something about the social treatment of this disease that seemed to be more effective than medicating people with antipsychotics, literally. People on antipsychotics will suffer again and again and again a recurrence of their symptoms and then constantly say that the illness is just intractable. It's just that bad. And they believe that if they didn't take their meds, it would be 10 times worse, when there's no evidence to support that. In fact, there's evidence to support the opposite. So just like we cannot even think of schizophrenia as an individual's problem or an individual's disease, we can think of schizophrenia as something that can occur within a group of people that needs a group of people to treat it and respond to it. I believe that mass shootings, we are making this happen through our culture. We are encouraging the growth of this phenomenon, and we are actually deflecting from recognizing that truth because we have at the ready the mental illness diagnoses, the rhetoric of individual pathology, and a medical system that banks on that ideology and runs it like a thread through all these other systems. So it's a dominant rhetoric in the workplace, in schools, in hospitals. We cannot watch commercials at night. My husband and I can't watch commercials without being pelted nightly with these ads for medications. You know, we allow direct to consumer advertising in the United States, and virtually everywhere else it's banned for a reason. One of my favorite musical artists is Sting. One of my favorite songs of his is All This Time, and this is a lyric from it. Men go crazy in congregations, they only get better one by one. But do they? I would say no, they don't. It's the opposite. It's actually the opposite. Because isolation appears to be a major factor in the run up to a person entering such a state that they'll end up committing a mass shooting. They tend to spend more and more of their time alone or on the internet, engage less with others in person, they have fewer significant social relationships, and they don't appear to be well integrated into communities, which is a thing that's happening with the general population. Community is becoming rarer and more difficult to maintain. So men go crazy in isolation. They only get better in congregation, in concert with others as part of a stable whole. So the whole has to be stable. And what we're trying to do right now is say, all this chaos is happening in my feed right now on YouTube. It's doom and gloom, right? It's just the United States is falling apart at the seams. We're on the verge of collapse, societal collapse, societal collapse. This is failing. Mental health crisis, housing affordability crisis, children can't read in school crisis, shortage of police officers crisis, shortage of educators crisis, right? So we are pretty much reaching a point of consensus that our society is absolutely shitting the bed. And what we're doing with the mass shooters is looking to stabilize individuals, thinking that the more we push this rhetoric of stabilizing the individual through treatment and medicalization, then all we've got to do is stabilize the individuals and then the whole will be stable. When we know through life experience that the whole has not been stable, this whole that is the United States has been an absolute like powder keg. It's been absolutely like a rickety bridge across which I have walked the last 2 decades. The recession, COVID, political violence, January 6th, disinformation, conspiracy theories, obesity, chronic illness, you name it. It's not stable because the more and more we cry out, if you, individual citizen, can get yourself stable, then but it's actually the opposite. It's a top-down effect. So the more that we stabilize the system, stabilize the economy, stabilize the educational system, believe in institutions, less chaos, less technological, what have you, less gigification, less apps, less AI, that will actually produce stable individuals. But we must stop confusing the cause effect trajectory. We must stop confusing these pathways. I'll conclude with a quote from Jodi Picoult. She's a fiction author. I wanted to conclude by saying something about how these individuals are often characterized as being lone wolves. The lone wolf killer. It's the one you got to look out for, right? And the problem is everybody is wearing like a mask, right? Everybody is a potential huntsman. That's what's scary about them. The wolf, whatever. I'm not making great sense, but that's what's so scary about them. It's sort of like if everybody is a husky and dogs are walking around, you can't at first glance, right? Because these individuals are normal, ordinary men. They're not people that you're going to see on a street corner talking to themselves and drooling. They're not identifiable mental cases. They're just not. That's what's so terrifying. So this quote, I woke up one morning thinking about wolves and realized that wolf packs function as families. Everyone has a role, and if you act within the parameters of your role, the whole pack succeeds. And when that falls apart, so does the pack. These are some of the data sources that I used. I did rely on ChatGPT in pulling a lot of the stats. I will put a link to the neurotransmissions video in my description. Thank you very much for hearing me out. If you like this, share it with somebody important to you. Take care. Be well.